Hello and welcome to another video from the only channel that you need to not only survive the current apocalypse, but actually enjoy it. And today's video is going to be part 6 in my series of angels and men, and this part is specifically going to be about identifying what the 144,000 spoken of in the book of Revelation represent. In my last video, I explained that unlike the religious systems of the empire that claim that the 144,000 are especially holy humans, the Bible specifically identifies them as loyal angels. But at that time, I also said that all of the angels in Revelation are spoken to and about as if they are celestial objects, or as if they are witnessing and participating in some celestial event. If we're willing to acknowledge that God created everything, including the stars and planets, we should have no problem accepting that He would also have the ability to alter how those objects function. Several examples that the churches have not attempted to hide from us would be the lengthening of days, earthquakes, fire raining down from heaven, and of course the global deluge of Noah's day. But there are quite a few things that the churches are actively concealing in the Bible that are obviously celestial in nature. Before I tell you about those celestial events and phenomenon, I first have to explain a few facts about world history that you're not going to get from the public education system, our so-called higher learning centers, or our networks. Most people recognize that a lot of what is recorded in secular history and the archaeological record supports what is recorded in the Bible. So they have no problem using secular history to try to decipher parts of the Bible that are not easy to figure out. The problem is that as representatives of Satan's religious empire here on the earth, the churches are required to focus all of their effort into steering people away from creation and towards civilization. That means that they have no choice but to use secular history and archaeology to explain nearly everything in the Bible. In this video, I will be referencing secular history and archaeology in order to lend support to what I'm going to share with you from the Bible, but I will not be using secular history to explain the Bible. My agenda is nothing like that of the empire. When I want to understand some confusing passage in the Bible, I always try to find other passages about the same event. The Bible is usually very good about explaining itself, but there are confusing passages that are in the Bible that seem as if they are written about things that are just common knowledge. And for people living at the time that the passages were recorded, they may have in fact been common knowledge. But to us living thousands of years after the writing, much of what may have been common knowledge at one time is now lost knowledge. But we live in what is known as the information age, which means that we have access to more information today than at any time in human history. Good information as well as bad. But both the good information and bad information can provide useful clues in our search for lost knowledge. Many cultures from all parts of the earth have so-called flood myths. These stories are not identical, but they often share certain details with one another, such as the preservation of animal life. One version that many people are familiar with is the story of the lost city of Atlantis. Another version of this story appears in our Bible. The Bible's version of the story is so plainly spelled out that we have no problem accepting that the so-called flood myths probably describe an actual event. That being the case, we readily accept that those flood myths, although probably not in complete agreement with the story of Noah's flood, are most likely secular accounts of the same flood that is spoken of in the Bible that we all voluntarily perceive as truth. Other so-called myths involve mighty gods and demigods that supposedly once ruled the earth. Most of us who are studying the Bible are aware that it speaks about fallen angels interacting with humans and even speaks of powerful hybrid beings resulting from the mating of those fallen angels with humans. Irregardless of how we understand such scriptures, if the Bible is real to us, then we have no problem making the correlation between the Bible's stories about angels and Nephilim and secular stories about gods and demigods. I always say that there is really no such thing as mythology, only secular history. And ancient secular history is much like our modern history. It is very difficult for us to determine what to believe and what not to believe. But there is one big difference between the stories that are being created in our day and those that were created in the ancient past. Today's mythology is all being created by a very small group of singularly minded, extremely wealthy men. These men have at their disposal the most advanced electronic communications network in human history. If they want us to believe something, all that they have to do is get their story together, and at the push of a button, whatever they come up with is nearly instantaneously dispersed to every man, woman, and child in the industrialized world in whatever language they happen to speak. Supposedly, back in the ancient past, such a system didn't exist. And if we're to believe what we were taught back in public school, many nations were not even aware of one another's existence. These kinds of teachings are the grounds for such beliefs as the mythos surrounding the so-called discovery of America. That being the case, we have to at least give some credence to any story that is told in any culture which resembles a similar story as told in any other culture, especially if those two cultures supposedly had no contact with one another. That being the case, we would have no choice but to believe that there must be some truth to the story, that at some time in the distant past a global deluge must have occurred, even if the story of a flood had never been recorded in the Bible. The same can be said for stories involving gods and demigods. If every culture on the earth had an Ice Age myth, we would have to give at least some credence to the stories being generated by the religion of science. According to science, early man experienced a global catastrophe which caused a large portion of the inhabited earth to become encased in ice. It would be ridiculous to put any faith in such a story when you consider that all of the cultures that supposedly experienced the Ice Age never bothered to leave any record of such an event, even though nearly every single one of those cultures left detailed records of events involving gods, demigods, and a global deluge. In attempting to disprove what I'm saying, practicers of the religion of higher education say that the similarities in the stories are due to migration. In other words, at some time in the distant past, the original small group of humans from which we all evolved may have experienced a local flood and then dispersed to all corners of the earth, taking their flood stories with them. This explanation would allow for the spread of a lie. In other words, it's pretty much impossible for every culture on the planet to independently of one another come up with a story that matches. But it is possible for a lie to have one point of origin and then to be dispersed due to migration. This is the empire's explanation for why so many diverse cultures from so many parts of the earth have so many matching outlandish stories. There is a story of another catastrophe, even greater in magnitude than the flood, that is told over and over again in one ancient culture after another. The story of the sky. Many ancient cultures around the globe left behind descriptions of the night sky that match each other but do not in any way resemble the sky that we are sitting under today. These stories are much more difficult to explain away. It could be possible that these stories were all created at one point of origin and then dispersed by migration, but the stories that are told describe things that no human being could have known prior to the invention of such devices as the telescope. The planets that are spoken of in the ancient night sky are described in great detail as if they were very close to the Earth, and they appear to be the same planets that we have today because they have the same features and are the same colors as the planets that we can view from Earth using man-made observatories, just not in the same locations or traveling in the same patterns. These myths are also similar in that many record that at some point at least one of the planets was destroyed in a collision with another planet. It was not until the early 1800s that scientists located an orbital path between Jupiter and Mars filled with the debris of what could easily have resulted from such a collision. The moon that once orbited that planet was not destroyed, but to this day still follows its mother planet's debris field as it travels around the sun. Scientists have named that moon Ceres, but refuse to acknowledge that Ceres was once the moon of that destroyed planet. If scientists were to acknowledge that human beings in the ancient past were able to visually witness the collision that caused the formation of the asteroid belt, then they would have to accept that there must be some truth to the other eyewitness accounts of incredible celestial phenomenon as well, all of which supports the Bible narrative. Throughout the Bible, celestial phenomenon are spoken of as markers for historical events associated with the war between Satan's empire and Jehovah's kingdom. But it isn't until we get to the book of Revelation that celestial events become prominent. In the beginning of this series, I spoke about historic events associated with the relationship between angels and humans. Later, I spoke about how those historic events involving fallen angels are told using a variety of animals representing the characters in the stories, and then later how those same stories were told using the imagery of sheep and goats. Revelation alludes to much of that imagery as well, but as I have already said, Revelation primarily tells the story using the imagery of celestial bodies and phenomenon. I've heard several atheists give long, drawn-out explanations about how the Bible is no different from any other ancient book of astrology or mythology, and they all base their assumptions on similarities in the subject matter involving celestial objects and phenomenon that are found in the Bible, particularly as found in Revelation. But there's a very big difference in the way that the stars and planets in Revelation are presented and the way that they are presented in astrology and mythology. Astrology and mythology always speak of how the movement of the stars and planets governs our lives, while the Bible always speaks about how Jehovah governs the movement of the stars and planets. I've already said that all so-called mythology is really just ancient secular history. Since every culture on the earth has experienced the same global events that every other culture has experienced, it is understandable that there should be a common thread connecting all of those ancient cultures with one another. That common thread would explain why all religions are nothing more than different versions of the same religion. In all of those ancient religions, the gods are associated with celestial objects and phenomenon. Those false gods were also associated with days, months, feasts, and festivals. It should be obvious that the similarities that exist in cultures spread out over the entire planet over a period covering all of human history cannot simply be a coincidence. To any atheist pointing out the similarities between the Bible and mythology, I say thank you. Several of those celestial events recorded in the Bible would be the presence of the seven so-called spirits of Jehovah. When we consider that the book of Revelation is about the restoration of all things, this seems to match perfectly with ancient accounts that speak of a time when 7 planets, which were clearly visible from Earth in great detail, suddenly disappeared. In our English Bibles, the restoration of those 7 planets to their proper place is described as the stars falling from heaven unto the earth. Many English Bibles translate this by saying that the stars fell onto the earth, making it appear that this account is about a planet-destroying cataclysm when it actually isn't. In the original language of Koine Greek, the word Astarte can mean star or planet. And the word ais can be translated as either into, onto, or towards. In the case of the planets and stars, our English word towards would be more appropriate. In the case of the actual angels, onto might be more appropriate. In ancient Greek, both concepts would have automatically been understood. It must be acknowledged that the Sumerians, who were an extremely ancient society, actually told stories of a time when there were 10 planets clearly visible from the Earth. The Bible has a very simple explanation for why 3 of those planets are not counted among the 7 that are spoken of as the 7 spirits of Jehovah, but that is a subject for another day. Another obvious celestial event would be the moon turning to blood while the sun becomes black as sackcloth. This account would be describing a simultaneous solar eclipse and lunar eclipse. Such an event is an impossibility in our current solar system, since we only have one moon and none of the planets between us and the sun are close enough or large enough to cause a solar eclipse. But there is an incredible amount of evidence that cannot simply be ignored that this has not always been the case. In the ancient past, the Romans celebrated what is called the Saturnalia, a holiday to the planet Saturn. This holiday is where we get our current holiday of Christmas. The 2 holidays are practically identical. However, much earlier in human history, Saturn, the planet, was said by astrologers to have ruled over the first hour of the 7th day. In modern times, we call the 7th day of the week Saturday, which comes from the Roman Dies Saturni, meaning Saturn Day. Many languages refer to this day as the day of Saturn. However, many other languages refer to this day as the day of rest. As an example, in Spanish, this day is called Sábado. In Jewish culture, this day is referred to as Shabbat, or the Sabbath. Every religion on the earth has what is considered to be a holy day. All of these days are supposedly based on the fact that something profound occurred every 7th day in the ancient sky. Since there is nothing that happens every 7th day in our sky, it is only reasonable to assume that something has changed. In our day, there is a big dispute among certain religions over which day of the week is holy. But in the past, when the solar system still functioned properly, everyone would have observed their holy day or days according to some observable celestial event in the sky. It's not likely that any of us will ever be able to determine conclusively what that event or those events were until the Creator of the heavens restores the heavens. In ancient cultures, God's people would have observed a day of rest once a week. Satanism, on the other hand, would have required its adherents to participate in some form of religious observance once a week. Rather than rest once a week, many people still insist on participating in some form of religious services once a week. Humans are not nocturnal, meaning active at night. This is because we instinctively go to sleep when it's dark and wake up when it's light. We are what is called diurnal. It is possible that every 7th day would have resulted in a solar eclipse over the Promised Land due to Saturn's appearance. Understanding this fact gives us some insight as to why God's people who would be observant of natural law would rest, while Satan's people who would be under covenant law would attend religious services. The ancient priest of Saturn wore black robes, which is why the priests of many modern religions still wear black robes, and is also why lawmakers and judges traditionally wear black robes, and it is also why the Bible refers to the sun being black as sackcloth, as opposed to simply saying that the sun was darkened. Such scriptures are direct references to the satanic cult's usage of black robes in their worship of Saturn. Saturn's rings are memorialized in art as rings around the heads of many of the gods of many different religions, including the gods of Christianity. Saturn's rings are referred to as a halo, and in ancient art the rings around the heads of the gods and saints are called halos as well. Saturn is so far away that it appears in the night sky as a tiny speck of light, far enough away that its rings were not discovered until 1655, 47 years after the invention of the telescope. Using a telescope, Galileo was able to detect that Saturn had some kind of unusual feature, but was unable to identify that feature as rings. Ancient art appears to depict Saturn as having rings, even though supposedly we didn't learn of those rings until thousands of years later. If Saturn was actually closer to the Earth at one time, an eclipse certainly would have been possible for part of the day as the planet passed between the Earth and the Sun. And it's also very likely, as the rings of Saturn passed between the Earth and the Sun, there would have been some kind of colorful display. Such colorful displays of light are also depicted in ancient images of the sky. There is no way to scientifically prove that Saturn was ever closer to the Earth than it is today, but the evidence is compelling. And the Bible's depiction of the Earth, as well as our solar system after the resurrection, does not sound anything like our current Earth and solar system. We cannot say what part of the Earth's surface would have been affected by Saturn's appearance, or any other celestial object for that matter. Prior to relatively recent accounts, there really isn't any detailed data about distance, orbital paths, axial tilts, speed of rotation, or any other such nonsense necessary to prove or disprove anything other than that people in the ancient past claim to have witnessed things that would not be possible as our solar system is currently configured. Scientists make the claim that they can produce data proving beyond a doubt that what I am telling you is impossible, but please be advised that they can also produce data proving that the flood never happened, but instead that ice ages happen on a regular, recurring cycle. They can produce data proving that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. They can produce data proving that all life on the planet came about by a process called evolution. And last but not least, scientists are able to produce data proving beyond a doubt that there is no God. Know this: producing such things as food, shelter, and clothing requires actual physical labor as well as actual results. Producing data requires nothing more than a certificate from one of the empire's higher learning centers combined with a government grant. Another obvious celestial event prophesied about in the book of Revelation would be the making of the waters bitter by the so-called star wormwood, which is a serious abuse of the Greek phrase Astarte absinthe, a reference to some planetoid orbiting the Earth, causing a congealing of the waters and returning them to what the Bible calls the Sea of Ice. Revelation also mentions two witnesses. The Bible speaks in other verses of the sun and moon being God's two witnesses. Revelation 11:4 calls these two witnesses two olive trees and two oil lamps, which is also another obvious reference to the celestial lights. In the Bible, oil lamps provide light from the burning of olive oil, which comes from olive trees. Placing these two oil lamps next to two olive trees would be an indication that these lamps would produce an unending source of light from two unending sources of olive oil, meaning that these two celestial lights would be sustained forever. If you look up these scriptures for yourself, you'll find that many Bibles translate the word luchnia not as oil lamp, but as candlestick. But this is just another attempt by the churches to mislead us. Luchnia can only be translated as oil lamp. To translate this word as candlestick is ridiculous. The two witnesses are said to be killed and left out on the broad way for 3½ days. The broad way is a reference to the surface area of the earth that the sun and moon would have passed over in the course of a year. In our day, that broad way would encompass the area between the two imaginary lines known as the Tropics of Cancer and the Tropics of Capricorn. However, since the cities Sodom, Egypt, and Jerusalem, which are said to be on that Broadway, are hundreds of miles north of that area today, it is quite obvious that something about our planet's axis has changed drastically at some point in the distant past. All of these celestial objects mentioned in Revelation represent angels, and the two witnesses are no exception. In a future video entitled The Book of the Angels, I'll talk about these angels in greater detail. Now that we've established that there is an actual connection between the celestial objects and phenomenon in Revelation and angels, we need to figure out what celestial phenomenon or object is associated with the 144,000. There are going to be several very important Bible concepts that you're going to have to understand if you wish to grasp the significance of what the 144,000 stands for. Genesis chapter 1 and verse 14 says that God created the luminaries of the heavens to mark off the passing of days and months and years. But in the original Hebrew, it could also be understood that the movement of the planets and stars was to remind us of sacred events. Some English Bibles choose to word it the first way, while other versions choose to word it the second way. It appears to me that both ways are equally correct. The Bible very clearly associates celestial objects with rulership. Genesis chapter 1 and verse 16 openly states that the sun would have governmental dominion over the day, while the moon would have governmental dominion over the night. And these words in Hebrew actually are governmental dominion, which is easy to see because the Bible uses these same words when speaking of the authority of political rulers such as Solomon. The word that we translate as star is actually Kaukab, which can be translated as either star or planet. This is clearly demonstrated at Amos chapter 5 and verse 26, where the Kaukab Kayun is spoken of, which in English literally translates as the planet Saturn. Everyone that has ever taken part in the translation of ancient Hebrew is very well aware that Kaukab Kayun translates as planet Saturn and cannot be translated any other way. The church is choosing to translate this verse as the star Kayun, or the star god, is an obvious and blatant attempt at once again concealing God's sacred truth from mankind. In this and the surrounding verses, God is telling the nation of Israel that He hates all of their sacred feasts and festivals, including the Sabbath, telling them that their observance of the Sabbath day is nothing more than Saturn worship. In the Bible, angels are often spoken of as stars, and angels are often referred to as rulers over humans. Satan himself is referred to sequentially as first the ruler of Babel, then Egypt, Assyria, Phoenicia, Greece, and Rome, as well as the current empire. But what do the sun, moon, stars, and planets rule over? They rule over time, and time rules over all living things, including humanity. This concept is going to be very important if we wish to understand the Bible, in particular the 144,000. At first, It may be difficult to make the connection between the rulership of time and the rulership of people, but that relationship became extremely important very early in human history. When Adam and Eve were created, they woke up in a world ruled by natural law. Part of that law was spelled out in the scriptures that we spoke of earlier at Genesis chapter 1 and verses 14 and 16, which says that the luminaries would rule over us and mark off the passing of days and months and years, as well as sacred events. The way that they would do this is by visibly appearing in the sky. As humans, we primarily depend on our sight for the majority of the input that we use in our day-to-day activities. Other living things also rely on their vision as well, but not all. Some creatures rely primarily on their abilities to sense things such as sound, taste, smell, and feel. Some even sense things that our bodies are not even equipped to detect, such as magnetic fields. For such species, the appearance of celestial objects may not have served the same purpose as they would have served for man. But for humans, the visible appearance of celestial objects in the sky would be a natural way for us to mark the passing of time. In the evening, when the sun would set, our bodies, just as those of many other living things, would tell us that it was time to go to sleep, and we would show our obedience to natural law by doing so. Our observance of sacred feast, fast, and festivals would also be ruled by this system of tracking time. Nowhere in the Bible have God's people ever been given instructions to observe some event that required the use of a timepiece. Instructions from the Creator regarding the observance of time always depended on easily observable phenomena such as the setting of the sun. It is obvious from the wording of the verses mentioned that we would perceive more from the heavens than simply the passing of day into night, and so by examining the Bible we should be able to figure out what celestial phenomenon a human living at the dawn of creation might witness in the heavens to mark off the passing of time. We've already spoken of Saturn's role in the ancient past. However, little of the Bible is about life before the flood. But after the flood, part of our solar system was still functioning normally, and quite a bit of the Bible narrative was written during and about this time in human history. In the Law of Moses, every year, on the first day of the 7th month, someone would be appointed to signal the appearance of the lunar eclipse by the sounding of the shofar. It is obvious from the wording that this would be a dependable annual event. Anyone could look up in the sky with the unaided eye and easily perceive the Earth's shadow on the surface of the moon as we passed between it and the sun. No special instruments would be necessary for the Jews to be able to mark the passing of this event. From this date, every feast, fast, and festival of the Jewish religious year could be determined. The gift of sight that our Creator gave us was enough to allow us to perceive this. Our instinctive perception of the passing of time could be measured by this clearly visible celestial phenomenon. The Creator put an end to this observance thousands of years ago by altering the movement of the Earth and Moon. We no longer have an annual lunar eclipse to mark the passing of the first day of the 7th month. However, the fact that this annual event actually once took place is preserved in the rituals of many of Earth's religions even today. Many of Judaism and Christendom's religions still attempt to make their rituals seem legitimate by using not the lunar eclipse as the Bible requires, but the moon phases. The rules that they follow in order to achieve this are truly bizarre. None can agree on exactly how the timing of their rituals should be achieved, since it was one of the Creator's mighty acts that put an end to these rituals. Attempts at keeping them alive are nothing more than direct attacks by the churches against God. Keeping God's word concealed from mankind has allowed millions to be fooled into participating in these as well as many other religious practices. Jesus lived on the earth about 700 years after his Father took the sun and moon out of conjunction. Even still, there are many that will argue that Jesus always kept these observances because they have always been told that he did. But the Bible only speaks of Jesus as a grown man keeping one, and that one was the Passover at which he was slaughtered. During Jesus' life, he was once asked why he did not observe the Jewish fast. And his reply, as recorded at Mark chapter 2 and verse 19, was that the sons of the bride chamber are not allowed to fast in the presence of the groom. In the Bible, the sun and moon are consistently referred to as the groom and bride. The sun and moon are also universally referred to in this way in all other ancient religions as well. In our day, the religions of the empire conceal this information by making their adherents believe that God's Son would regularly participate in religious rituals. They can make it appear as if God approves of such activity. Of utmost importance in the Jewish law code was the Sabbath. I already explained what secular history records about the marking of the seventh day prior to the flood, and it should be obvious that anyone alive at that time would instinctively understand that the seventh day had begun, simply by looking into the sky. Whether or not there was still something observable on the Sabbath in Moses' day is not clear, but what many people don't understand is that the Sabbath wasn't just every seventh day, but every seventh year as well. Jewish law even required the observance of every 49th year because it was a Sabbath of Sabbath years. This 49th year is what we refer to as a Jubilee. All of this was recorded as a marker for an even more spectacular event that Revelation speaks of, the Sabbath millennium, also known as Christ's 1,000-year reign. Our Creator would not require that we keep count of how many times Saturn appeared in order to determine which Sabbath was a Jubilee, or even which Sabbath was the beginning of the Sabbath year. I think that it's safe to say that something more spectacular would occur at the beginning of the Sabbath year than would occur on a typical Sabbath day. I also feel that the Jubilee would be even more spectacular still. In the ancient past, cultures around the world recorded planetary alignments that seemingly were more spectacular than anything recorded in modern times. It is obvious from these accounts that our solar system does not in any way resemble the solar system of the ancient past. From the description found in Revelation, it seems quite obvious to me that every object in our solar system is going to be involved in the celestial phenomenon spoken of in the book of Revelation. When all of the planets return to their proper dwelling places, keeping track of time will be quite simple. In fact, it will be instinctive. Our keeping track of time will require nothing more than obedience to natural law. Sometime around 4,000 years ago, the Creator caused Abraham to fall into a deep sleep, and it is recorded at Genesis 15:13 that God told Abraham that his descendants would be enslaved for 400 years. Later, at Acts chapter 7 and verse 6, Stephen recounted this event as he was being executed. According to the religions of Christianity and Judaism, this prophecy had its fulfillment when the nation of Israel was enslaved by the Egyptians. But anybody with a pencil and paper can add up all of the years of Israel's enslavement and see that the total comes up hundreds of years short. But the churches are expert liars, and so they have created several doctrines to conceal what this very important prophecy is actually about. What was actually said to Abraham in his dream is that his descendants would be enslaved by the Orbe Mehashanah, which in English would more accurately be translated as the cycle of 400 years. Stephen confirmed this by saying that Abraham's descendants would be enslaved by the Tetrakasios Atos, the 400 years. The reason that this prophecy is so important to our discussion is made quite clear when we take into consideration that when Abraham had his dream, the Creator had not yet altered the earth's orbit around the sun. Abraham's year was still 360 days long. So in effect, what Jehovah was telling Abraham was that his people would be enslaved to the 144,000. 400 years made up of 360 days would come out to be exactly 144,000 days. When Jehovah told Abraham that mankind would be enslaved by the cycle of 400 years, it is obvious that he was speaking about a regular cycle of time ruled by some natural system that could be detected earth-wide. Since Genesis says that the Creator made the luminaries of the heavens to rule us, then it's only reasonable for us to come to the conclusion that the 400-year cycle was not going to be determined by using only our vision combined with some celestial object in the heavens. Our natural ability to observe the luminaries of the heavens was God's chosen way for humans to recognize the passing of time. This 400-year cycle had to be something that would be more involved than simply peering into the sky to observe the position of the Creator's luminaries. When the first humans were created and placed in our Father's forest, they awoke to a world ruled by natural law. Every living thing that had been created before them was subjected to this law as well. Every tree and plant automatically followed a cycle which allowed them to take in matter from the surrounding soil, absorb moisture, and use energy from the sun to convert those things into usable nutrients. These nutrients would allow the trees and plants to grow and reproduce. All of the animals consumed the products of the trees and plants, such as leaves, seeds, and fruit, and used the energy from consuming those things to grow and reproduce offspring themselves. These natural cycles required that all of those things follow a synchronized pattern, not just with those of the same species, but synchronized with all other surrounding species of plants and animals as well. People who study the fossil record say that 99% of the life forms that exist in the fossil record no longer exist as living species. Alterations made in those natural cycles are almost certainly the cause of every single extinction level event that has ever occurred. Many of those species have gone extinct in modern times, and every single observed occurrence has involved damage done to the Earth's natural cycles by humans. No other species of living thing has the ability to voluntarily break free from their instinctive observance of Earth's natural cycles. The ability of a species to observe the passage of time and be obedient to the cycles over which time has governmental authority is instinctive. This instinctive obedience to time is a form of knowledge. It was not the kind of knowledge that a living thing would acquire over the course of its life, but knowledge that such things would possess at birth. Many living things do acquire knowledge over the course of their lives, but even this learning process is part of our instincts. Baby chicks know instinctively from birth that they require water. But until the mother hen takes them to the water source and shows them how to drink, they will not do so. But even this learned behavior is instinctive. The mother hen knows instinctively that she has to teach her chicks to drink. Baby chicks know instinctively to watch their mother and imitate her behavior. Hence, a behavior that is learned instinctively. When baby chicks arrive from the hatchery, they come with instructions about how to care for them. And the first instruction on the list is to take each chick individually to its water source and dip its beak in so that it will learn how to acquire water. Hence, an instinctive behavior that is learned unnaturally. To members of the empire's churches, or to any other person that is spiritually dead, The difference between these two ways of learning how to drink water are inconsequential. As long as a chick learns to drink water, it doesn't matter how it does so. But to anyone that loves God, the instinctive way is nothing at all like the unnatural way. For the baby chick and mother, the instinctive learning experience provides gratification. The mother hen gets pleasure from teaching her chicks, and her chicks get pleasure from their mother teaching them how to drink. Using the unnatural method not only deprives both the mother and chicks of this natural instinctive pleasure, but actually causes them discomfort. And since civilization's hierarchy is based on slavery, there is also going to be a human that experiences discomfort due to this unnatural way of doing things as well. Even though many creatures can learn to do things that are natural and beneficial, most cannot and will not learn to do things that are unnatural or non-beneficial. Some animals, like dogs, elephants, and dolphins, can learn to do tricks such as jumping through hoops. But you cannot teach a spider, rose bush, alligator, or fish to repeat any unnatural or non-beneficial task such as jumping through a hoop. Humans are a form of higher order mammal and can be taught to repeat unnatural, non-beneficial behaviors. The churches teach that humans are not animals because animals don't have souls, or animals don't have the capacity to feel or express love. But as is always the case, these teachings are not supported by the Bible, or not supported by any kind of science, and are in fact demon-inspired. The reason I'm even mentioning this is so that you can have a clear understanding of one very important trait that does make humans different from every other species on the planet. Even though animals such as dogs, elephants, and dolphins are different from other living things in their ability to learn how to do unnatural things, they never pass on these learned behaviors to their offspring. A dog, elephant, or dolphin may jump through a hoop as a form of play or out of necessity, and their young might instinctively follow, but no such animal will ever teach its young to jump through a hoop on command. Humans are the only part of creation that will do such a thing. Humans will often spend hours filling out forms about things that are nobody's business, or stand in line for hours in order to request permission to engage in something that is obviously a natural human right. In the vernacular, being forced to engage in such activities is referred to as jumping through hoops. We do not instinctively do these things. We, just like other trained animals, are forced to do these things by other humans. In the Garden of Eden, human beings were ruled by God. This was God's natural law. Throughout the Bible, we are constantly reminded that God's law remains forever. Part of that law was that humans were not to eat of the tree of knowledge. In exchange for not eating of that tree, God promised that humans would live forever. However, humans were endowed with the capacity to make their own decisions. They could choose to follow God's natural law, or they could choose not to follow God's natural law, and hence begin our 6,000-year history of jumping through hoops. The only law mentioned in the Bible that exists outside of natural law is covenant law. Very early in human history, a very powerful angel, referred to in the Bible as a cherub, approached the first woman with an offer to enter into covenant law. A covenant is a legal agreement between two parties. This angel offered the woman an opportunity to learn about things that only the Creator and the angels were aware of. According to our modern English Bibles, he promised her that this knowledge would actually make her like God. Another promise that he made was exactly the same as the Creator's promise, that she would live forever. This covenant was sealed when the woman ate fruit from the tree of knowledge. Later, she was able to get the first man to eat some of the fruit, bringing him into this covenant as well. The angel that did this would no longer be spoken of as a cherub, but instead by such terms as Satan, meaning adversary. By definition, covenant law has to be different from natural law. Otherwise, covenant law would be natural law. Since natural law required humans who were subject to the passage of time to observe that passage using the luminaries of the heavens, those entering into covenant law could now observe the passage of time by other means. Since a Sabbath day marks the passage of time that we refer to as a week, we can ask ourselves if the cycle of 400 years is a special number of weeks. Since 144,000 is not divisible by 7, it is very obvious that the cycle of 400 years was not a special number of weeks. We could also determine the same thing by simply repeating the process for Sabbath years and jubilees. If we should do so, we would find that neither a cycle of 7 years nor a cycle of 49 years was part of any cycle of 400 years. Another naturally occurring cycle mentioned in the Bible would be the month. At one time, a month was exactly 30 days long, meaning that every year had exactly 12 months. And so it is no surprise that since 144,000 days is equal to 400 years, if we divide the 144,000 days by 30, we find out that there would be exactly 4,800 months in a 400-year period. It is obvious that the Bible attaches no significance to the number 4,800, since this number is never mentioned anywhere within its text. There also seems to be no special significance attached to the number 4,800 in the archaeological record, mythology, or any other ancient information. So the 400-year cycle is apparently not related to any special number of months. In God's Word, we are told that 1,000 years is like a day, and a day is like 1,000 years. Scriptures about this concept that are recorded in God's Word have gotten a lot of attention in the war between those practicing the religion of creationism and those practicing the religion of evolutionism. But in the original languages, such scriptures have very little bearing in that conflict. All that is being said is that the Creator recognizes a millennium as a standard cycle of time. Once again, if we do the math, we will find that a cycle of 400 is not related to a millennium, which is a cycle of 1,000. 1,000 is not divisible by 400. It is extremely important that you understand this basic math related to God's way of keeping track of time and Satan's way of keeping track of time. There is not one single time cycle in Jehovah's way of tracking time that is in any way related to Satan's way of tracking time. You must understand that making humanity obedient to an unnatural way of keeping track of the passing of time is one of Satan's greatest achievements. One of the first things that the Creator did was make the luminaries of the heavens in order to give mankind the ability to instinctively take part in the cycles of the natural world. By simply altering that cycle, mankind no longer knows when to do such basic things as eat, sleep, socialize, reproduce, and migrate. We are now fully insulated from the natural world that was created to care for our needs. Hopefully you are beginning to grasp that there is a big difference between being ruled by the heavens and being ruled by a clock. In the ancient past, celestial phenomenon accurately marked off the passing of time. If you are unwilling or unable to believe that what I am saying, then you're going to have to come up with some kind of explanation for why so many cultures around the globe left archaeological evidence that they were aware of a planet with rings, as well as why many cultures around the globe recognized 7 days as a standard unit for the measurement of time. For me, the archaeological record on this matter is overwhelming, but the archaeological evidence for civilization's cycle of 400 is even more overwhelming. If you are familiar with the phrase hidden in plain sight, you are really going to appreciate what I am about to tell you. In the Bible, Satan is referred to as the ruler of 7 consecutive empires. History records that these empires actually did exist at one time and were in fact the 7 greatest empires to have ever existed. They are, as named in the Bible chronologically, Babel, Egypt, Assyria, Phoenicia, Greece, Rome, and what the Bible refers to as the empire that would come after Rome, meaning our current world empire. This is why Satan is called the 7-headed dragon, and civilization is called the 7-headed beast. Each of these empires either followed or is following a 400-year calendar. Around the world there are ancient pyramids, and some believe that these pyramids weren't used by aliens as landing platforms, or that they were some kind of communication devices or power generators. Evidence to support such theories is sketchy at best, but it is understood by everybody that one function of these pyramids was the marking of the passing of time. Most of them, if not all, at least once a year would mark the passing of the summer solstice. But just like their smaller counterparts, the sundial most very likely did much more. The Great Pyramid was built before the flood, and it is possible that others were as well. Most were obviously built after the flood. There is really no way to know for sure exactly how these structures would have indicated the passing of time, because so many pieces to these archaeological sites are missing. And as I said earlier, even the way that the solar system functions has been altered since the time of creation. But there are clues about how some of these structures might have functioned. In particular, the Great Pyramid. Since the pyramid used light from the sun as part of its mechanism in tracking time, that is a big clue about some of the things that the pyramid might have done. Some might claim that since the sun was involved, natural law was not broken. After all, the sun is one of Jehovah's luminaries. But linguistically, that is not at all the case. The pyramid was not tracking the movement of the sun, but instead the movement of our home planet, the Earth, relative to the sun. The Earth would not qualify as one of our luminaries. If we think of the Earth as a large clock, then the pyramid would represent the hands on that clock. The pyramid was not constructed to tell us if it was morning or afternoon. It was designed to tell us much, much more. The Bible calls Jesus the stone that the builders rejected. The builders that the Bible was speaking about in those verses were represented by an extremely powerful demon-possessed group of evil men. The descendants of those men still rule the earth today and are still possessed by those same demons that possessed their forefathers. In ancient Hebrew, the scriptures in Daniel about a stone being removed from a mountain are not at all about a stone being removed from a mountain, but in actuality are about the capstone being removed from the pyramid. The word mountain does not appear in any of those scriptures in the original text. The translators are well aware that the actual Hebrew word used in that verse can only be translated as pyramid. Later, Jesus is called the chief cornerstone. Once again, the church's translators know that the words that they consistently translate as chief cornerstone is actually the Greek phrase for capstone. It is no coincidence that each and every empire mentioned in the Bible as being directly under Satan's control used the image of the capstone as a symbol of their civilizations. I did a video once that goes into much greater detail on this subject called The Stone That the Builders Rejected. You can find that video in the Bible Truth playlist associated with this channel. If you look at the back of a US $1 bill, you can see this symbol of human ownership. But if you look at the image, you'll notice that it was not just of the capstone, but also of the pyramid itself. Remember what the Bible says. Jesus is the stone that the builders rejected. The image is on the back of the $1 bill is of the capstone that the builders accepted. Please keep this in mind. Knowing that there are multiple references to the pyramid in the Bible is indicative of the fact that this structure symbolism is pivotal in the way of life associated with Satanism, also known as civilization. One of the greatest clues as to the identity of the 144,000 was actually built into the pyramid itself. The Great Pyramid is made up of more than 2 million stones. However, for the most part, those stones were low-quality building stones, probably of little symbolic importance to us, especially since there has never really been any way to view those stones. But the stones on the exterior of the pyramid were of very high quality and were highly polished to a mirror finish to act as reflectors. From a distance, this huge stone reflector would have had the appearance of a star. Each of those exterior stones weighed about 15 tons. Scientists say that if those exterior stones were still in place, the pyramid would be visible from the moon. It's also said that the pyramid would have been visible from the mountains of the Promised Land, in particular the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. This fact will be extremely important as your understanding of the Bible increases. In the year 1356 AD, Bahri Sultan and Nasir al-Din al-Hassan had the exterior stones of the Great Pyramid removed. Many of those stones were eventually used in the construction of buildings within his empire. I have not been able to locate any information about why he would go out of his way to have 15-ton, oddly shaped stones removed from an ultra-slick surface over 450 feet up in the air, and then to use those stones as common construction material. But it is safe to say that it would have been much easier to have simply quarried those stones than to have them removed from the pyramid. Satan put the idea to do this in his head in order to cover up a secret. The obvious reason for doing such a thing can be understood if we examine what was taking place at that time. When the stones were removed, the only Bible available was in Latin, and the only people that spoke Latin were the religious leaders of the Latin Church, whose sole purpose in life was to conceal the information in the Bible from the rest of humanity. However, the Bible was about to be translated into the language of the common man. In less than 30 years, John Wycliffe would be publishing parts of the Bible into the common language of what would eventually become the Anglo-American world empire. It must be understood that John Wycliffe was well known throughout Europe for his opposition to the teachings of the empire's religious system. 30 years after his death, the Pope had his remains exhumed so that his bones could be ground up, burned, and thrown into the River Thames. In any case, Satan knew that eventually the entire Bible in nearly every language of man would be printed. The evidence that was preserved in the exterior stones of the pyramid had to be destroyed before the Bible could be made available to the public. But fortunately for us, historians from the ancient past had already examined the Great Pyramid and made notes about its appearance. Several historic ancient texts from eyewitnesses made in the centuries after the flood state that the Great Pyramid, unlike all of the other pyramids around the world, had no capstone, and more important still, that the main body of the pyramid was encased in exactly 144,000 highly polished stones. This is not a coincidence. The precise number of 144,000 casing stones isn't the only similarity recorded here. The interior stones of the pyramid are for the most part intact, so we can know for a fact that the pyramid was symmetrical internally, meaning that there is no reason to doubt that it must also have been symmetrical externally. That being the case, there would have been an equal number of casing stones on each of the 4 faces of the pyramid. That would come to exactly 36,000 on each of the pyramid's 4 faces, in perfect alignment with each of the cardinal points of the compass. 36,000 facing north, 36,000 facing south, 36,000 facing east, and 36,000 facing west. Revelation says that Jesus' 144,000 would be equally divided up according to the 12 tribes of Israel. 12,000 from each of the 12 tribes. If we go back to the 2nd chapter of the book of Numbers, we will see that the 12 tribes of fleshly Israel were commanded to make camp around the tabernacle as they traveled through the wilderness in their journey from Egypt, the location of the Great Pyramid, to the Promised Land. 3 tribes to the north, 3 tribes to the south, 3 tribes to the east, and 3 tribes to the west. It is very obvious that if the 12 tribes of the 144,000 spoken of in Revelation were to follow the rules set down for the fleshly tribes in the book of Numbers, there would be 36,000 facing each of the cardinal points of the compass, just as in the case with the Great Pyramid. In Christendom, it is a common teaching that the tents were laid out in the shape of a cross. However, in the original language of Hebrew, there is nothing to indicate that the tents would be laid out in such a pattern. The command to form up around the tabernacle used the word neged, which means conspicuously round about or within sight of. The concept of the cross was not even introduced into the Bible until it was translated into Latin by the Roman Church. In Jesus' day, neither the word cross nor the idea of a cross existed. No such word or concept appears in any original language book of the Bible. The word that we translate as crucify is actually staru, meaning to affix to an upright, pointed stake. Prior to the establishment of Christendom, there are actually no words in any language describing any form of execution involving anything in the shape of a cross. I think that it should be very obvious that since the first culture to create such a word was Christendom, it is very probable that Christendom was the first culture to initiate the use of such an evil device. In fact, some of the earliest reliable accounts of people actually being executed on a cross involve Christians not as the victims, but as the inflictors of this form of torture. As I stated in my All-Seeing Eye video series, the pyramid's capstone represented Satan's trinity of political system, economic system, and belief system. Once again, there are similarities. When viewed from overhead, the fleshly nation of Israel would have been stationed in their smaller tents around a larger tent known as the tabernacle, which housed the Ark of the Covenant. From overhead, the positioning of the tents would have resembled the positioning of the casing stones of the pyramid around the capstone. Within that ark was Jehovah's version of a political system, the 10 Commandments. Jehovah's version of an economic system, manna, and Jehovah's version of a religious system, Aaron's rod, which was associated with several miraculous events, including coming to life as a serpent and later coming to life by sprouting leaves. There are also similarities in John's vision of heaven, where the 144,000 are stationed around our provider, Jesus, who referred to himself as the bread of life, and who in the manner of Melchizedek was both a king and priest. Once again, in response to each of civilization's foundation stones, which I already said would be the economic system, political system, and belief system. Many are familiar with the phrase sacred geometry. Most of what we call sacred geometry is identical to what we today call just plain old geometry. This field of study has developed around the world in much the same way. Geometry is essential in architecture, and in particular in ancient architecture. Men have been building incredible architectural structures around the world for thousands of years, and the instruments necessary to do so seem to be standardized around the globe. And keep in mind, once again, these cultures supposedly had no contact with one another. Even though these instruments share similarities, they differ in units of measure. Just as we have cultures that use inches while other cultures use centimeters, ancient cultures had different units of measure as well, with one exception. All cultures around the globe measure angles based on a circle being divided into 360 degrees. This unit was chosen based on the fact that the Earth's year was once 360 days long. The religion of higher education teaches that the ancient peoples were unaware of how long a year actually was. This despite the fact that they built some of the greatest wonders of the world using extremely precise instruments based on a 360-day year. My theory is that anyone with such obvious advanced understanding of architecture and geometry would certainly know how long the year was. In our day, kings, presidents, industrialists, college professors, scientists, and popes are very well aware that the year is about 365.25 days long. Even minimum wage workers, prisoners, and migrant workers within our empire are aware of this basic fact. Even the indigenous peoples of the planet, all the way from the 7th century BC to the time of their eradication in our modern day, understood that the year was about 365 days long. Prior to that, every culture on the planet understood that the year was 360 days long. It is an absolute, indisputable fact that prior to that time, the Earth indeed took 360 days to complete its journey around the sun. There is no other viable possibility. There are pyramids all around the world. They all seem to share similar design characteristics, and most, if not all, are associated in one way or another with calendars that kept track of time in 400-year cycles of 360-day years. If Christopher Columbus really didn't discover this continent until 1492, then finding an identical way of tracking time in the Americas would have to prove beyond a doubt that in the ancient past our Earth really was ruled by a 400-year cycle of 360-day years. Just as is the case all around the world, there are pyramids in the Americas. Many of these pyramids are thought to have been built by a people known as the Mayans. These pyramids are on the opposite side of the planet, and yet all of them are associated with the Mayan long count calendar, which kept track of time using 400-year cycles of 360-day years. Once again, for a total of 144,000 days. In ancient Hebrew, this cycle was referred to as the Arbe Mahashana. In the ancient language of Koine Greek, it was called the Tetrachasios Etos. In the Mayan tongue, it was called the Baktun. But all of these words mean the same thing, the 400-year cycle of 144,000 days. I think that I have proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that people around the world once followed a 400-year calendar. We don't really have to explain why. Remember what I said at the beginning of this video. If cultures in one part of the earth left records detailing something that doesn't seem possible, and yet sounds very similar to a story from another part of the earth, we have to believe there must have been some truth to it, even if it doesn't sound plausible. Stories of gods and demigods, stories of a global deluge, unusual descriptions of our neighboring planets, and official calendars to track 400-year cycles of 360-day years, all from diverse cultures around the globe, cannot simply be ignored. The preponderance of so much evidence from so many witnesses from so many cultures across so many years of human history would have to be accepted as proof if presented to any jury open to logic. We do not need secular history to explain what the Bible is about. The Bible explains what the Bible is about. Secular history only confirms that the Bible is a true history of the world as seen through the eyes of God. If someone can understand the Bible for what it actually is and empty their minds of all the lies that the churches have used to explain the Bible, we can understand the world around us for what it actually is. Understanding what the Bible is actually about can even unlock the so-called mysteries of the pyramid. I already explained why the pyramid had 144,000 casing stones, but until now I haven't explained to you what those casing stones actually did. We know that the exterior casing stones reflected light because many of those stones were used in other structures and can still be viewed today within those structures. But another feature that nobody seems to be able to explain is the fact that each side of the pyramid is slightly creased down their centers, causing the two halves of each side of the pyramid to face angles that differ by about 1 degree. This causes each of the pyramid's faces to actually be two different planes facing into one another. If you want to see what I'm talking about, just do a Google image search of the phrase 8-sided pyramid. This feature is virtually invisible, only being detectable during certain times of the day when the sun is at just the right angle, and when the reflective stones were in place, it would have been even less detectable than it is today. 1 degree of angle over so large a plane doesn't actually alter the appearance of the pyramid's 4 faces, and does not add any structural integrity. What it did do was add an insane level of difficulty to the actual design and construction of the pyramid. Only the Bible can explain why so much effort was put into creating something that seemingly served no purpose. The Festival of Saturnalia that I spoke of earlier was also known as the Festival of Lights. There are several explanations as to why this is so, and there is some validity to those explanations. But I'm going to tell you what the actual truth is. In the ancient past, our planet appeared much different than it does today. Like Saturn's rings, our planet had a feature made up of frozen water molecules above the atmosphere, referred to in the Bible as the Sea of Ice. We are not supposed to know about this feature, so our English translations of the Bible call it the Sea of Crystal or the Sea of Glass. Such a rendering makes it virtually impossible for anybody reading a modern Bible to ever figure out what the Bible is talking about. In the book of Genesis, it's referred to as the sky window, but once again in our English translations we read about it as the floodgates of the heavens. None of the ancient Hebrew words appearing in this part of the Bible could in any way be translated as flood, gate, or floodgate. At another scripture from Genesis, it is referred to as the waters above the expanse, when it would be so much easier to simply translate it properly as the waters above the atmosphere. But as I just said, the churches do not want us to find out what the Bible is actually about. The reflective stones from the exterior of the pyramid would have reflected light from the sun into that sea of ice, creating a light show over a very large area, probably encompassing the entire land of Egypt as it existed at that time. The 4 sides of the pyramid wouldn't have reflected that light from 4 planes, but from 8. Even though only 1 degree of difference exists between the 2 halves of each side, over the miles that the reflected light would have to travel to reach the Sea of Ice, there would have been a considerable amount of separation between the 2 halves of each side. The capstone itself is not available for examination, but almost certainly wouldn't have had this dual plane feature. That being the case, each side of the pyramid's capstone would have reflected light 1/2 of a degree out from each of the halves of the lower part of the pyramid. So rather than shining a light on 8 individual areas of the Sea of Ice, the pyramid would have reflected light onto 12 areas in that Sea of Ice. Once again, The 12 fields of light that would have appeared on the sea of ice would have created a direct correlation between Satan's pyramid and Jehovah's 12 tribe nation, which was a response to that pyramid. There is no way that I know of to duplicate the effect that this would have had. We can speculate about the colors or shapes that would have appeared in the sky, but that probably wouldn't lead to an accurate description of what the ancients would have witnessed. We can know that as the sun came up, it would have only reflected off of one or two sides at the most. Through the course of the day, it would probably have reflected off of three or as many as all four sides, but it would only be as the sun passed directly over the top of the capstone that a perfectly symmetrical pattern would appear around our sun in the daytime sky. For this to happen, conditions had to be perfect, and the effect would have only lasted for a moment. Knowing that the Earth's axis has shifted at some point in the past, we cannot know where the pyramid was at the time of its construction relative to the equator or relative to the tropics of Cancer or the tropics of Capricorn. However, if the capstone of the pyramid was at one time directly over the equator, it would have put on its display twice a year during the vernal equinoxes. If it was at either of the boundaries of the tropics, there would have only been one display a year. The original Festival of Lights would have ended thousands of years prior to the Saturnalia celebrated by the Roman Empire, so we can't even know if the two festivals took place at the same time of year. If the pyramid was originally constructed at a location directly over what was at that time the equator, then there would have been a nighttime effect as well. As midnight approached, people living at the time would have been able to see 12 reflections of our moon gathered around our actual moon. I personally don't believe that the pyramid would have been positioned at this location, however, as it would have produced a perfect display, daytime display, once every 200 years, as opposed to once every 400 years, as is preserved in the satanic cycle spoken of twice in our Bible. We do know that cultures around the globe recognized our year as part of a 400-year cycle, which means that even though there would have been solstices and equinoxes every year, they would not have taken place over the same spot every year, but only once every 400 years. Let me clarify. Every year at the so-called solstice, the sun would reach the limits of its annual cycle directly over the imaginary line defining that limit, but not directly over the exact same spot. The sun would not remain on the equator or either of the tropics lines for the entire 24 hours of that day, but would only touch briefly upon it, at which time it would immediately reverse course and begin its journey back to where it came from. One year the sun might reach that spot directly over Egypt. On other years it might reach that spot directly over the Pacific Ocean. The light show from the pyramid would have been quite striking every year, but only once every 400 years would its display be perfect, because only once every 400 years would the sun be precisely over the capstone of the pyramid. Much has been written about who built the pyramid, how they did it, and why they did it, but nobody anywhere has even the slightest clue about the actual truth. Civilization's religious system has dedicated a huge amount of resources to the task of concealing what the Bible is about from mankind. Every reference to the ice shield encasing the earth has been removed from our English translations of the Bible, and every account related to the ice shield recorded in mythology is simply dismissed. Without this information, nobody could ever hope to understand the function of the pyramid. It should be obvious that without modern scientific instruments, no human could ever hope to understand that the Earth's solstice occur in 400-year cycles. Certainly, no one living at the time that the pyramids were constructed could have ever hoped to figure this out. In Isaiah 14 and verse 12, Satan is called Lucifer, which means light bearer or shining one. Lucifer is actually a translation of the Hebrew word halal, which is where we get our word halo. And 2 Corinthians chapter 11 verse 14 says that Satan keeps transforming himself into an angel of light. Without Satan's assistance, no human would ever have figured out that the Earth's solstices were part of a naturally occurring 400-year cycle. The 400-year solstice cycle is a very real, scientifically provable fact. Our planet's solstices are still bound by a cycle of 400 years, even today. The Empire still teaches that the reason every culture on the Earth had a 360-day year was because they didn't have the technology to determine the actual length of the year. It doesn't really take a whole lot of technology for a person to be able to tell when it is summer and when it is winter, when the days are long and when the days are short. Over the course of only a couple of years, nearly anybody could figure out exactly how long a year is simply by sticking a rod into the ground and measuring its shadow every day. The 400-year Earth cycle would not be so easy to detect. In fact, it's only recently that our modern culture has advanced enough scientifically to be able to figure out that our solstices are governed by 400-year cycles. It is possible that the ancient Egyptians had advanced technology that was simply lost over time. There are quite a few people that believe that this is the case. For those who subscribe to such a belief, you are still going to have a hard time explaining how the Emperor of Rome was able to figure out this same thing in 1582. That would have only been a little over 400 years ago. The Dark Ages had long since passed, and our records of this time are fairly complete. There are literally thousands of volumes of literature from that time describing every device imaginable that existed, and absolutely nothing available to Pope Gregory XIII would have allowed him to figure out that the Earth's solstice cycle was 400 years. And yet the Gregorian calendar, which is still in use today, is based on a repeating cycle of 400 years. The Bible specifically says that the Emperor of Rome was possessed by Satan the devil. And at the time, Pope Gregory XIII was the Emperor of Rome. Prior to the Babylonian conquest of the Promised Land, about 2,700 years ago, every culture on the planet left records indicating that the year was 360 days long. After Jehovah altered our solar system and ended the Earth's 360-day year cycle, every culture on the Earth scrambled to try to figure out what was happening. We have ancient calendars from this time based on every possible combination of numbers you can imagine, without any conformity whatsoever. Even in Greece, during the time that Greece was the dominant world power, we find that nearly every city had its own calendar, and few of them matched the calendars of neighboring cities. If you look up the Gregorian calendar, you will find information about why Gregory created the calendar. At that time, different churches were celebrating Easter on different days, so Gregory created his calendar in order to unify Christianity in its celebration of what he at the time called the sacred days. But if you notice, according to the Gregorian calendar, Easter is on a different day every year, and even at that time, the churches continued to celebrate Easter at different times from one another. But what nobody understands is that the actual sacred days that Gregory was preserving were the sacred days of the 400-year satanic calendar. Satan promised Eve enlightenment, and the 400-year calendar of his empire would be proof that he had kept his promise. If you are unable or unwilling to accept what the Creator of the universe has just shared with us, then you are truly lost. If after listening to the words of these videos you insist on continuing to attend the satanic rituals of one of the empire's religious systems, then you are even more lost. And it doesn't matter which religion you prescribe to, whether Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, or one of the thousands of other satanic cults, none have God's approval. In the very near future, those of us who love truth and love one another will instinctively understand what is happening to the world around us. And when we know that the end of civilization is imminent, we will rejoice. At the same time, the members of the empire's religions are going to be cowering in their churches and temples with absolutely no idea what is happening to them, praying to their gods without getting any kind of answer. Our God is not one to be mocked. Anyone who continues to participate in one of the empire's religions as we approach the last days is mocking God. At the dawn of creation, our perception of time was ruled by the luminaries of the heavens. The Creator's cycles of 7 days, 7 years, and jubilees of 49 years have never even once corresponded to anything on Satan's calendar based on cycles of 400 years. But that is all about to change. In the very near future, 6 millenniums of satanic rulership dominated by human slavery will come to an end. Jesus, along with his 144,000, will take over rulership of the world, freeing mankind once and for all. When he does so, the 7th millennium will begin. This millennium, also known as Christ's 1,000-year reign, will begin. On that day, humanity will enter into what the Bible calls God's rest. This will take place on the final day of the 15th cycle of 400 years. The 15th Baktun, the 15th Tetracasios Etos, the 15th Arbe Mahashana. There will not be a 16th observance of Satan's 400-year cycle. At the end of Christ's 1,000 years of rulership, he will hand the kingdom back over to his Father on a day not at all related to the 400-year cycle. The fact that the Bible says specifically that Christ will rule with his 144,000 is God's guarantee that when Christ does so, the heavens will be restored. Everything in our sky will be exactly as it was on the day that Jehovah said, "Look, everything is very good." In the very near future, no one will ever need to check their schedule again. Nobody will ever even think to refer to a calendar or look at their watch. When the luminaries of the heavens are restored to their proper place, we will instinctively know everything we need to know about our place inside of the stream of time simply by using those luminaries that God provided for us. In the very near future, this slavery-based demonic system that we call civilization will be done away with forever. If you don't want to survive, don't listen to me.